bachelor's from Yale University, his master's from King's College, University of London, Fulbright Scholar, and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania, summa cum laude, Order of the Coif. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium Professor Brian McCall.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here in St. Mary's. I enjoyed last year when I came in September to speak with this group, and I was very happy to receive the invitation to come back and talk about another very important topic for business people, for business owners in particular, the employment relationship. So before we delve into the topics, it reminds me of sort of a brief little story that will illustrate a few points, perhaps. Once a gentleman stopped at a gas station, and he was filling his car, and he saw these two men carrying shovels walk along the road. First man was digging a hole maybe 2 or 3 feet deep, then he'd move on. The next man would fill the hole back in, and then he'd move on, dig the next hole, fill the next hole back in. He thought, this is extraordinary. So he calls the two men over. He says, what's this with the holes? Why are you digging holes and filling them back up? He said, oh, sir, we work for the county. He says, what? Well, it seems like you're wasting the county's money. I mean, what are you digging holes and filling them for? Sir, you don't understand anything. You don't understand what's going on here. He said, usually, see, there's me, there's Joe and Mike. And I dig the hole, Joe puts the tree in, and Mike puts the dirt back. Now, just because Joe is sick today doesn't mean we can't work. So I think we're going to get a little later on, perhaps this story will illustrate some of the misconceptions about the employment relationship that pervade our society. But to move on to the substance of the talk, I'll just give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. First, there's some preliminary remarks on some key principles, some core principles. Then the 3 topics that really inform our discussion, that of justice, society, and the common good. And we'll talk about those. Then we'll talk about their application to businesses and the employment relationship. And then finally, we'll move on to some very practical suggestions, some ideas about how we apply those principles to our situation. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it seems like a lot to get. I just want to hear the answer. What should I do? What's the practical solution? And it's really why I have the preliminary remarks. It's very important in this topic to start with the principles and not just rush to the answer. As in practice, the clients, what's the answer? Just tell me what I need to do. Now, in that situation, as you probably know, if you've had the distinct pleasure to deal with lawyers in your business, they charge by the hour. So that's why clients are like, quick, tell me the answer, because I know if you talk for an hour, I'm going to pay you more. I'm not charging by the hour, so don't worry. You don't have to worry about that, so we can take our time and go through the actual principles and just not get to the bottom line. They're very important in our time, these core principles, and knowing the principles is very important. Aristotle, when he defines a virtue, and that's justice, what we're going to talk about is the key virtue. He says there's sort of 2 ways, in a sense, that we can be virtuous in our action. One is we can understand the principles. We understand what the virtue is, think about it, deduce the action from it. But another way, since a virtue is a habit, a way of repeating actions, is that we adopt the habit. We perform the virtuous actions, and then we become virtuous through performing them, and then we often then come to know what the principles are behind them. Well, in different times, in different societies, it was possible to just more or less get by with the second method. Everybody's sort of doing the right thing, more or less. They're enacting the virtues, more or less. And if you sort of go along with the way things are, you are more or less going to acquire virtues. The problem is we live in what I call later, we'll talk about the new dark ages. We live in an era where that is not a safe route at all to practice virtue and learn virtue, because our society is turned on its head. And the habits that our society promotes are vices, not virtues. And so that's why people of our time, much more than of other periods, need to understand the principles. That's why it's so important. Because we can't simply acquire habits of action and learn virtues that way. We really need to go back to the principles, because we are at bay in terms of what the rest of the world is doing. So again, a little bit by way of apology, why we're going to start with some very kind of theoretical points, but it's very important in our time. First of those is the principle of the relationship of truth to morality. And yet lots of times if you ask people, what's more important, to know the truth or do the right thing? or do a good act. They'll, oh, do good, got to do good. Do good to go to heaven. They're right. I mean, we have to be moral. We have to do the right thing. But actually, it's not the right priority. And very much so in our time, given what I just said. The truth comes first. We have to know the truth, or we're not going to be able to do the good. The good is what we want to desire, what we order our actions towards. But you can't move towards that which you don't know. You can go back to your Baltimore Catechism. It's a very important order. Why did God make you? To know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him. Knowing comes first. So the truth is important to know where we're going to get these actions we're going to talk about, where they come from. So truth is of the most importance. That's why we start with principles. The second preliminary remark is not to confuse principles with their application or living them out in particular circumstances. And that's a very, very important distinction. Principles, which represent truth, they tell us about the world, the way the world is, are unchangeable. The truth does not change. What was true 2,000 years ago is true today. It will never become the case that murder is okay. Murder is always wrong. That principle is true. It never changes. By contrast, the application of those principles is going to have to change over time in the sense that those principles are lived out in different circumstances. So, murder is always wrong, but our society develops new technologies, and then some of those result in death. Abortion. New methods of procuring pills. Well, that proposes now a question of application. Is this murder? Well, yes, it is. Okay, now I know it's wrong. So there's always new applications, new circumstances that we find ourselves in where we have to figure out how we work through the new circumstances to find the principle, where the principle is. But what's important is we don't confuse the two, because in certain historical periods there were different circumstances and those principles applied to different facts. And so we don't just go back and say, oh, here's exactly what they did. Well, exactly what they did may not conform to the true principle in our circumstances. That's very, very important to see that distinction, because sometimes people make the mistake and say, well, someone just did this. But in the context of our circumstance, that may no longer conform to the principle. Now, I guess it was about 2 years ago now, to help illustrate how important I think this is, it's a little bit of a humorous story too, I wrote an article critiquing a rather unfair critique written by His Excellency Bishop Williamson of Bishop Fillet and the General Chapter of the Society, when they articulated the key principles that they were following in relations with Rome back in the 2012. And I started the article with actually this very point that I'm trying to make here, that there's a distinction between truth in terms of what reality is, what is the truth out there, and what should I do, what action should I perform. And I quoted St. Thomas Aquinas, usually a pretty safe source among traditionalists, right, for his definition of what truth means in terms of knowledge as opposed to choosing action, the theoretical and the practical realm. And he defines, he says, truth in the theoretical realm is your mind is conformed to what's out there. So if my mind says murder is good, what's out there says murder is wrong, I do not have the truth. I have something wrong. So it's a correspondence of the mind to the actual facts. In the practical realm, what I should do now, should I, in that context, go meet the Vatican or officials in Rome and talk to them or not? Should I consider this practical agreement or not? Those are decisions that don't relate to truth in terms of reality. They relate to a good action. And there St. Thomas says a true action is an action that's conformed to a good, to a principle, to a good principle. So it's a different understanding when you're choosing actions, because an action of signing an agreement, a piece of paper with the Vatican official, for example, in and of itself, it is what it is, but whether I should do it or not will depend on what's in the paper and what the circumstances are. And so it's important that the first step is understanding truth out there, knowing the principles which are immutable, But then understanding when choosing exact particular actions in your life, there's going to be many more complicated circumstances. The goal is to make sure the actions you're choosing are conforming to those true principles, that they are oriented to those true principles, and that you're not just rationalizing to do what you want. Now, again, here's the humorous part. As some of you may know, Father Thiemann came to St. Mary's shortly after I had written this to give a talk about the same topic to all of you, which was an excellent talk. And he actually started, coincidentally, with the same point, about the importance of these distinctions between the truth of reality and truth of action, of good action. And I happened to come across, somebody sent it to me, because I usually don't go look for these things, but this person who wrote, not quite as long as the Pope's recent exhortation, maybe it was only 30,000 words, still outrageously long, response to Father Thiemann, and he started off saying, well, first thing with this Father Thiemann is he doesn't know what he's talking about, because this whole thing about different definitions of truth, he just stole from this law professor guy who made it up and wrote it in an article, which, as I said, I quoted St. Thomas. So this, why I pause on this is how important this is, that to get these distinctions down, because we live in a society where even those who seem to be affiliated somewhat with the traditionalist movement are a little confused on these ideas. Okay, as we move on, I think you'll see how those preliminary remarks are important. So to talk about the employment relationship, there are three key concepts we need to go through first so that we can then apply them to the context. Justice, society, and the common good. So what is justice? Basic definition. It's a virtue, so it represents the constant and perpetual will to render to another that which is his. So in your will, you want to give people what is owed to them, what is their due. Now, that then begs a question. Okay, in order to have justice, I have to know what people's due is, what belongs to them, what is theirs, so that I can then have the will to do it. Well, this is a more complicated answer, because it is not everything in our modern world we want to make simple. The liberal world wants to simplify everything, level it down, and just have these very trite, simple answers. It actually is multidimensional. The truth is three-dimensional. Modern era, if you look at it, often becomes one-dimensional. They try to just eliminate aspects of it. And I have this little diagram to help you see the three pieces of justice and how they fit together. It's not mine. This comes from the philosopher Joseph Pieper, who wrote in the mid-20th century, based on Aristotle and St. Thomas. Again, not making any of this up, so when people write it on the internet and all these crazy things I'm making up, basically just summarizing what St. Thomas took from Aristotle. So there are three aspects of justice relating to, here we have A and B are individuals, two people, and then up here we have the community, C, the community. And there are three ways that these three parts of the triangle can relate to one another. A and B can interact with one another. And when they do that, A and B will owe things to one another as a result of their interaction. And that's called commutative justice. It's giving people their due when you're dealing with them. Right? So, basic definition of commutative justice is equality in exchange. So if I'm dealing with you, if I take something from you, I should give you something in equal exchange. Okay? So there's involuntary dealings. So maybe I crash your car. By accident even, I destroy your car. In justice, I owe you something back. Now, you had, let's say, a Ferrari, a real one that you can drive. If I come and get a little matchbox car and say, well, here, car, I give you a car back, I've not given you an equality in exchange. So I've violated what's due to you. Same thing in voluntary transactions. If I buy something from you, if we trade something, my obligation in justice is to give you something of equal value in exchange. So that's the first element of justice. The second element is distributive justice. And this is the relationship between a community, kind of footnote, we're going to come back to what's a community, what's a society, because that's our next concept, but between the community and the members of that community. And what distributive justice relates to is the common goods that are brought about by that community. So people that work together create some good, right, that comes out of their joint action. Those common goods need to be distributed among the members of the community justly. And that's the principle of distributive justice, which, unlike commutative, which was one for the other, equal exchange, distributive justice is proportionality. So not one car for the value of one car, but what do you deserve as a member of the community proportional to a scheme of distribution of how you fit into the community. Basic principle of distributive justice is merit, or what does your part in the community group project play in procuring those goods? And that your share of those goods should be proportionate. So, take a little example, a sports team. What's the A good that a sports team may produce? They win a championship. There's a certain honor that comes with that. And that's a good, a lower order good than something, but still a good. The honor, the success of having won. That honor is distributed, shared by the whole team, but it would be shared in a different distribution. So the guy that, scores the key touchdowns or does certain things that contribute in he can't win without everybody, so everybody deserves some share of the honor, but it won't be equal. It will be proportional to what they merit in the context of their group action. So that's a brief overview of distributive justice. The third relationship that can exist, so we have individual to individual, the community to the individual, then we have the individual to the whole, to the community. And that's what we can call legal justice. Legal justice is what takes individual actions. Again, this is what's due from the part to the whole, the member to the whole community, what he owes. What he owes is to coordinate all his actions in a way that furthers the common good of the community, the society we're dealing with. So a proper ordering to the community's common end, and then it's usually called legal because it's done through law. Law is what organizes the principle that organizes actions towards the common end. And when we talk about that one of the great contributions of Aquinas to this is to expand the definition of legal, which is very important for our time. Aristotle conceived of that solely as whatever the government, the ruling authorities make the law to be, the law in the books, what I studied in law school. So whatever that coordinates your actions for to the common good, that's what it includes. Aquinas expanded that to include all forms of law, particularly the natural law, which is above the individual ruling authorities, and the divine law, God's law. And he says, our duties in legal justice are not just what the rulers of our particular country tell us to do, but what law in its most broad sense. It's going to be very important for our time, because we've had a real breakdown of law in our communities in which we live in, again, these new dark ages. The last distinction, and I'll give you a brief quote. Most of my quotes will be from Pope Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, which was an important encyclical on this very topic of the relationship of employers, employee, businesses, written on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Leo XIII. And so in talking about legal justice, this is how Pope Pius XI described it. To define these duties in detail when necessity requires, these duties of justice and orienting towards the common good, and the natural law has not done so, is the function of those in charge of the state. Therefore, public authority, under the guiding light always of the natural and divine law, can determine more accurately upon consideration of the true requirements of the common good. So it's meant to make more specific your obligations in justice towards the whole. Now, the last distinction with justice, it relates to this, is very important. When Aristotle defines justice, he talks about justice per se, or what St. Thomas calls natural justice. Justice in its most general sense, and particular justice. In this situation with a real A and B, with a real community, with real law, the political specific justice enacted in particular circumstances. And what's important is you have to remember both of those apply. There's the more particular, but it is only the first line. And it's supposed to be derived from, as we would say as Catholics, the natural and divine law. The problem we face in our society is the particular is broken down. Our legal systems are completely perverted with liberal, individualistic, non-Catholic principles. And so many times we are going to always have to move back to the more general level. We can't just say, well, what does our government say our duties are? Because our government has no clue. It has disavowed the natural and divine law. And so, unlike Catholics trying to get these issues right in the 12th century, where more or less the state and the civil society listened to the church and tried to enact laws, they weren't perfect, but we're at least informed by these principles. Ours are generally not. Where they're in the law, they're hangovers from another era, We're living on borrowed capital from the past, to use a common expression. So often, we're not going to be able to just look to the particular versions of these enacted in our civil laws, but we have to go back to the higher principles. So, there are our three key idea about justice. Our second concept is society. What is society or a community? Well, first of all, again, even Aristotle, going back to the Greeks, understood that man is a social and political animal. We must live together in society. It is not possible for us to achieve our goals as a person, as God created us, to attain heaven without, again, Aristotle left out that last part, but we can add to it, to attain heaven without being in society, without working together towards our own end. Aristotle actually said this in an interesting way. He says, a person who does not live in society is either a beast, a brute animal, or a god. Again, he didn't quite get that right because he didn't understand or know the Trinitarian nature of God. So even within the oneness of God, there is an analogy, an analogous idea of community in the three persons. But what the point of it is we cannot even achieve our individual good, what we want, without being in a society. So what is a society? Society is a group of people who come together for a common purpose. Simple definition. Now, that purpose is what helps define what kind of society it is. A sports team comes together to have a common purpose of playing rugby or basketball. Right? A business is a society. People who come together for a common purpose, whatever the purpose of their business is. A city, a nation, a state are all societies with different purposes. The church is a divinely founded, but still a society, which has a common purpose. Now, there are two different types of these societies, perfect and imperfect, which relate to the end. Doesn't mean that the people in it are bad or good, in that sense of perfect or imperfect, but complete or not. So an imperfect society is a society whose purpose is not a final end. It's an intermediate end. So the goal of life is not rugby. Notwithstanding what my oldest son might think, who plays rugby at La Salette. It's not the goal of life. It has an important role in the education of young men, but it is only an imperfect end. It's a good, but it's a good that is meant to develop and lead to other ends. There are two perfect societies, the church and what we could call the nation. They're perfect because their ends are ordered to, on the natural and supernatural level, a final end. So on the natural level, a nation is ordered to the pursuit of all that is good for man to achieve his natural end, what he was created for naturally by God. The church supplements and enlarges that by building on that by saying, well, actually man has a second end, not just a natural end, a supernatural end, which is his eternal salvation. So those are the two, on the natural and supernatural level, the most complete ends. All other societies that make up that larger society pursue components of that end, parts of it. Schools pursue the end of education, which is part of the natural and supernatural end of man. Businesses pursue the satisfaction of some temporal needs, material needs that we all need to pursue our final end. And so businesses, when we get down to it, we'll see are a community, a imperfect society. People working together for an imperfect common end. So we're talking a lot about this common end, and you see how all these concepts are related. So that brings us to our third point, the common end or common good. What is that? When we say the end of the society. Well, good and end we're using interchangeably. It's a purpose that is consistent with our nature, again, natural or supernatural, depending on the context, that the group of people are striving towards. Now, what's important about this is that the common end, the common good, it directs all of the individual actions. So the society can only function through individuals. It needs people to actually do things to get to its end, and so individuals will perform actions. The common end is what harmonizes those actions towards the common purpose. Now, what's important is a lot of false modern philosophy looks at that as a dichotomy. It says, well, that's the common purpose as opposed to the individual purpose. The Catholic understanding of it, that Pius XI develops in Quadragesimo Anno particularly, is that there is no conflict. That's a false liberal premise. Because what's good for the community is good for the individual. their ends coincide, because what the common end is exactly the end of the individuals that he shares with everybody else. So we all have a supernatural end to go to heaven. That's my end and your end. That's our joint end. We both have that end. But they're not in conflict, right? There's not notwithstanding Calvin's errors, there's not a limit on people who can get into heaven. So it's not like, okay, the first 100 million, then you're done. So it's a competition. First one there gets in. No. There is no irreconcilability between our individual purposes and our common purpose. Our common purpose is the same as our individual purpose. And it's true on the natural level, not just the supernatural. Why? Because we share a common nature. We're all the same by nature. We have the same directed ends. And so that what the individuals are seeking is what the community will be seeking as well. Now, that means what's oriented towards that good will be good for both. So it's not in opposition, one to the other. What's also important to remember, though, that doesn't mean that all individual acts are good for the common good. Right? We can choose actions which are not oriented to that end, and that is the role of sin in the supernatural level. Right? The individual sinner chooses something wrong, and what makes it wrong? It's not ordered to the individual or the common end. It's not ordered to the common end of the church, because that's the salvation of her members. So when the individual chooses it, it's both against his individual end and the common end of the church. So there are three core concepts, and we're going to get down to a little more detail, start applying them to our topic tonight. Businesses and the application. As I alluded to earlier, firms or businesses are societies, they're communities, they are. And we don't tend to think of them that way. We say economics, individuals. That's individual, because we've been beaten into our heads since Adam Smith in the 18th century. But what was the whole understanding of the 18th century and the expansion of the current economic system was a recognition that we can actually do more if we come together. Individuals just doing on their own economically are going to achieve less. The very word economics actually comes from the Greek for household management. The family, the group working together. And so what are businesses? They are people coming together to pursue a common end together. Bringing different things. Bringing capital, bringing money, bringing skills, bringing time, bringing intelligence, etc. Now, what is their particular end? If you go to Harvard Business School or the Yale School of Management where I went undergrad, they'll tell you the end of business is profit. And they're right, but they're wrong. Profit is an end of business, but it's not its ultimate end. It's a means to a higher end. Now, just think about this. In many ways, it's actually commonsensical, if you think about it. So if I say, if you own a business, I say, let's take, you run a bookstore. What's the purpose of your business? If you say, oh, it's to make money. So what do you do? What's make money? I have no idea it hasn't given me any information. Say, oh, I run a bookstore, I sell books. Ah, now I know what the purpose of your business is as opposed to the one next door that's a pizza parlor, right? So what is the common purpose of the business? It's to supply, to produce or supply or deliver some good or service. And that's what defines each individual business. So the purpose of a business, its common end that you all work towards, is whatever goods or services your business chooses to produce for the wider community. It's interesting, when I wrote an article that I think was referred to in the email, I looked at, or had a law student help me look at 100 mission statements of Fortune 100 companies. And it's interesting, if you look at them, the first statements of almost all of them are, we seek to be the best X company or pharmaceutical producer or whatever they happen to do, car manufacturer. And their actual mission statements don't start with, our mission is to make money as their first principle. Why? Because I think everybody even understands this, notwithstanding the decades of being given misinformation, that your primary end actually is to produce some good or service. Now, that's not to say that profit is not important. It's a very, very important instrumental means. You can't stay in a business if you're losing money. So if you're running the bookstore and you're selling all your books at below cost, you're not going to fulfill your ultimate end of delivering books to the public because you run out of money. You go bankrupt. So to say that it's not the ultimate end, it doesn't say it's not important. It is very important to have an efficient business that sells goods at a profit, but it's not the ultimate end of business. Again, analogously, I like to draw on supernatural realm just because it's something, as traditional Catholics, I hope we're familiar with, but help us understand it. What is our ultimate goal? Is union with God, is grace, right? What is a means of those? The sacraments, right? And think about it in this sense, we don't receive the sacraments for an end in of themselves. That's to the extent modern liberal religion, where baptism becomes just an end in itself. You do it as a little ceremony for fun. We see them as transcending that immediate goal. So we have sacraments as and that, again, I say it because I know anybody here would say, oh, sacraments are just unimportant. By saying they're not the ultimate end, we're not degrading them at all. They're incredibly important because without them, you can't get to the ultimate end. Same thing with profit in a business. It's very important, but it's not the ultimate end. And that's a very important concept to keep in mind as we define the goal or the common good of business. And to back that up, in terms of people who own businesses making accumulating profit or wealth from them, Pius XI says it's a very good thing. He commends it. And when he later talks about it's not the ultimate end, this is again proof of his understanding. Quote from Pius XI. Expending large incomes so that opportunity for gainful work may be abundantly provided. However, that this work is applied to producing really useful goods ought to be considered, as we deduce from the principles of the angelic doctor, St. Thomas, an outstanding exemplification of the virtue of munificence, and one particularly suited to the needs of our times. So again, he commends people who run profitable businesses, but properly oriented. Why? So you're doing something useful for society. Right? Again, think about the principle modern economics says. Profit is the sole goal of the business. Well, then what's to stop me from selling pornography or selling contraception? My goal is profit. That's my goal. It can't be right that that is the ultimate goal of business, or it clearly leads to such absurd conclusions. What your business does is the end, and the profit is the important means to sustaining it as an instrumental good. Again, I'm repeating a lot because it's so much. Again, if you talk to any business school, that's what they're teaching kids. And look what that produced in the last financial crisis. Profit is the only goal. That's some of these businesses on Wall Street, all they existed for was making profit. What are you doing? Well, I don't really know. We're not really doing anything. We're moving digits around on a computer that generates a profit. Well, what does that do? And that's how we got into the mess we got in, because it blew up, because nobody was doing anything except moving numbers around on a computer to generate paper profit. And again, it's a result of this sort of false prioritization of goals or goods. So we've now looked at these basic points about what is justice, what is society, what is the common good. So we can now finally, after first half, get to what you wanted to hear about, right? The employment relationship. How do we apply these principles? First, relying on Leo XIII, Pius XI says, again, what's the first core relationship between an employer and an employee? Wages and work. So that's where we're going to start. So, as you probably know, Catholic Church talks a lot about the just wage. So we're going to talk about what does that mean, paying an employee a just wage. First point is, as Pius XI reminds us, relying on Leo, the just amount of pay, however, must be calculated not on a single basis, but on several. Again, modern liberals want to reduce everything to just simple things and eliminate what is in reality. What Pius XI tells us in reality, there are multiple bases of figuring out what's just to pay an employee. So we need to go through all three aspects of justice. Father Pesch, whose book I believe will be on sale afterwards, also emphasizes the determination of what's just in paying employees is a multi-factor determination. So first factor is commutative justice. The employee has a duty to render some service. In commutative justice, the employer has a duty to pay what is fair for that service, an equivalent exchange for what the employee does. That's the base start. And what's important is that applies even beyond the employment context. By employment, I mean someone who dedicates full time and some form of long-term commitment to a business, as opposed to what I'll call contract work. So you hire a guy to come paint your house, and he paints your house and leaves. Or even if you have a business, you hire someone to come and paint your factory. That's not an employee. Again, a distinction I'm sure you can see. But the employment relationship starts with that same principle. So if you hire someone to do a service, you should give them equivalent value for what they've done. Now, that in itself is a complicated calculation that involves an estimation. Right? And again, knowing that with great precision is difficult, more difficult in our world when we have a broken monetary system. Right? The purpose of money is so that we can compare values. So if I want to exchange something that's equivalent, if I want to give you, you gave me a yard of fabric, I want to give you a yard back, I want to use a ruler to measure and make sure I give you something fair. That's what money's supposed to do. So if I'm trading houses for shoes, I can say, well, how many shoes equal a house? We use money as a medium for that. Problem with our modern economy is that they've broken it so much, we're using a yardstick that every time we measure, it's changing its shape. Money has no constant value anymore. So one of the problems in commutative justice we face is when I measure your service, the yardstick we're using are dollars. Tomorrow we'll probably measure something different. And so we face a real practical dilemma. And what does the church tell us? Again, principles are immutable. We can never say, well, I just pay you an unjust wage because I just decide unjust, that's fine, that's good. As opposed to applying them where we're dealing with real factual situations that are difficult to sometimes see. What do? We need to make sure our intention is ordered to the proper end. I want to pay you a just wage. I'm given a broken ruler. I have to do my best to measure it as best I can. Right? So that's the base of the employment relationship, paying what is equivalent to the work contributed to the enterprise, the work done. Now, this is not going to be the same for everyone. Obviously, it can't be the case. And in fact, paying by excess or deficiency are both unjust. A lot of times people think paying too low is what's unjust. It can also be the opposite. Overpaying someone for more than they did is unjust because it's the goal, the principle is equality in exchange. And that's the important first principle. We also have to remember, though, that this is not the same as buying a good. It is not the same as just going and buying a tool or something at the store, because we're talking about services, so we're talking about people. Right? And so when we establish this relationship, that is why it's going to be multifactored, more than just the service rendered. The concept of a labor market didn't exist in the Middle Ages, because again, it wasn't viewed this. There was a big difference between going out and buying a wagon and contracting for labor, because here you're dealing with people, not just things. And that's why we have to move, when we're dealing with a longer relationship with people, into other factors. Last note, again, just to emphasize it, on commutative justice, it does vary on what's rendered. And Pius XI points out in Quadragesimo Anno that those who manage a business, those who manage the operation, the managers and enterprise, rank first among the various kinds of labor. And so it's just that they would be paid differently from someone who doesn't manage the business, because they're contributing something of first importance to the business. But, again, our society distorts a principle by excess. Again, it's true, and he said managers should, it wouldn't be right if the person who mops the floor, let's say, of the cafeteria for the business, that's his job, gets paid the same as the CEO. That actually would be unjust, because it's not an equivalent exchange. But if you look at our country, when top CEOs in our country make 200 to 300 times what the lowest worker does, there's a lack of proportionality between that, even though there should be a difference. So again, the principle is there that there should be a difference, but just because there's a difference doesn't mean you can't err by abusing the principle. Okay, what does the worker owe in exchange, the employee side? He owes the duty to give equivalent value. So if he is paid a certain wage, he owes giving that equivalent and not shirking his responsibilities. He owes, again, it's an approach to employment very much fallen out of our society. If you look at what's very much in popular culture, shirking, getting away with as much as you can, right? Oh, if the boss isn't looking, I'm going to, steal an extra break here and there. They are violations in justice, just as much as if the employer withheld his paycheck at the end of the week. Because he owes, if he's being paid X dollars per week, in justice, he owes to render equivalent service to the employer. So again, it's an important base of the employment relationship. Now, however, when we're in the context of an employee, we have a community. Right? And employees are part of the community. Who's in the community of a business? The owners, the managers, and the employees form a community. Just like in a political society, you would have, again, in classic Catholic understanding, the ruler, the monarch, the aristocracy, or those who assist the monarch in governing, and everyone else who participates in different levels in the governance of the community. Same thing in a business, same kind of parallel. And so what's important is we have a business that's going to produce a common good. And so in distributive justice, the whole, the community, owes to all of the members, not only giving them whatever is done in the individual exchange, but the distribution of the common good produced by the community. So what does this mean? Part of the factor in determining what employees are paid, a baseline again is the just wage for their work, but also a proportional sharing of the instrumental good the business produces, some of its profit. So, as Pius XI says, therefore with all our strength and effort, we must strive that at least in the future, the abundant fruits of production will accrue equitably to those who are rich and will be distributed in ample sufficiency among the workers. Now, what he does not mean at all is a communist notion of, well, we all get to share alike. No. Because again, what is the principle of distributive justice? Proportionality. So if a business makes $1,000 profit some year, doesn't mean if there's 100 people, including owners, employees, everybody, they all share, pro rata. No. Proportional distribution. Obviously, the person contributing the capital to run the business is very instrumental to it. Without it, the business couldn't acquire what it needs to work. They need a proportional return for what they're putting in, for what they're contributing. The worker, however, the employee, again, is indispensable. Without someone to do the work on what's there, it wouldn't happen. We've often confused because there may be labor, which anyone can do, unskilled labor. Well, if this person does it, someone else can do it, with the job being dispensable. That's not at all. Just because someone else can do it doesn't mean it's not indispensable. Without someone cleaning the factory, without someone running the lines, it doesn't happen. Even though someone else might be able to do it, maybe it's not a skilled job, they are still indispensable in their way to the common good. Without each part, the whole doesn't function. And they are entitled in justice to a proportionate share of what the business produces. Now, what does this translate into? Is again, depends on the circumstances. This is where the truth doesn't change. There's a duty in distributive justice. What it means changes on the circumstances. It means that if the business has great leaps forward and generates much, does very successfully, it expands, some of that injustice should be shared with the whole community in some way. Now, we'll get to some practical ways how to implement that, but that's a factor in determining the just wage. If someone works for a business that's multiplying its returns over and over and is still getting paid the baseline commutative justice, it is still an unjust wage. So they are entitled in distributive justice to some share, proportional to their contribution to the whole in distributive justice. It's the second factor. And here's just to sum up on that, another quote from Quadragesimo Anno. Wherefore, it is wholly unjust to ascribe solely to capital all the products which come out of a business. So again, the false argument he's arguing about is, hey, if I own a business and it makes all these profits, it's all mine, completely. Everything comes to me. And whatever the least I can pay workers, the better for me, because I get more. Pope says this is a false principle. Because you have a duty to pay them first for the work they contribute, and if they are a long-term part of the business, again, this distinguishes temporary contract workers, someone in a political sense that's not part of your community, a foreign government that you're having a treaty with. Distinguished from one of your citizens, you do have a duty to share with them a portion of the profits. Okay, third factor, and it's the most complicated in our time, is legal justice. Because the business is an imperfect society, as we said, it is not the perfect end, it is part of the wider community. And so part of what the business does has to be harmonized with the overall common good of man on the natural and the supernatural level. So the way in which the business does all these things that we've just been talking about must be affected and must be oriented towards the greater good of the society of which the business is a part, both on the natural and the supernatural level. So, This is often where the idea of the family wage is discussed, and I want to pause and talk on that. So, what do we mean by that? Again, the goal of a business is to provide a service or a good, and to provide a way of people making what they need to support their family, both the owners and the employees. And so for someone who dedicates full-time their commitment to the business, to stay with the business, Pius XI says, there's a duty to make sure they're paid a wage sufficient to support a family. Now, why is it importantly phrased that way? Because it embodies the whole teaching of the Catholic Church on man and society and how things should be structured. Now, it's premised on the fact that the family is the basic unit of the larger society, not the individual. We are not free agent individuals. Remember, we all have to be in a society. The family is the primary basis. And so the family is the primary unit that builds up the larger community that the business is part of. And so the business has a duty in legal justice that if this person is dedicating their full time, their full economic employment, that they are provided with at least the means to support a family. Now, this is, again, one of the most difficult principles for our time, because what has the modern world done? It has destroyed the family. It has leveled the family. And why is the most important way it's done this? They say they planned this in the early 20th century, is to get women in the workforce. Get women, break up the family. Get them out of the family. And sadly, when it comes to this idea of the family wage, the modern popes, in their social writing, have not supported this principle and have lauded women going into the workplace, leaving the family, having two incomes. And as always the case, whenever we go against legal justice, we do great harm. Not good. Because what was it promoted in the early 20th century? Oh, wives going out to work, it'll help the family because the family will have two incomes, will do better. What did it do? If you look historically over time, it cut wages. Because what did you do? You just doubled the workforce. And again, if it's an estimate of what contributed to the business, wages have been cut. And it's also made it extremely difficult to apply this principle. Because now, if you pay a just wage to the head of the family, and the wife's also working, if you actually pay what you should to support a family to both, you've doubled up. You've actually paid too much. And remember, too much is unjust just as much as too little. So, very difficult issue, but something we have to keep in mind, because if we're in a situation where we can actually apply it, there is a duty there to provide a wage, taking into account both of these factors together, that is at least sufficient to support a family. And if you pay something to someone as an employee who couldn't support their family on that, and you were able to do that, you create an injustice on the whole community. Why? Because you're forcing the breakup of a family. You're forcing the wife to have to go out to work. Again, the church never said women can't work. Again, the feminists are just nuts in the things they accuse the church of. Not the church said women can't do these things. They said, but women are not fulfilling their mission, their purpose, their natural purpose, when they divert their attention away from what it should be. And that is what the idea of splitting the workforce, dividing the workforce this way, and bringing both parents, and again, it's not to say, particularly in our society where it's often a need, where wives have to work because our unjust system has destroyed the family wage. So women, again, the assumption of the world is both husband and wife should work. Therefore, I'm only going to pay you half of what I would because the women are out there too. Sometimes women have to. Wives have to. And they're therefore not choosing an evil by having to do that, by having to break the family apart from the way it should be ordered. But they have to. It's a necessity. The principle is still the same, though, and where it can be implemented, it must. Again, think to the supernatural realm. Catholic states must profess Christ the King. But the church knows, in the atheist world we live in, there are a lot of countries that aren't going to do that, and has to accept the reality that there are, and that's why the doctrine of tolerance was put forward. We have to tolerate, it's imperfect, but that's all we can live with. But we don't deny the principle like Vatican II did and say, well, Christ isn't king anymore. We have to maintain the principle even when we can't actually apply it in our own life. Now, the other important limit on this that Pope Pius XI said is you have to, again, order ends. This is to order the business towards the common good of the society. You don't say, well, I have a duty to pay a family wage to every one of my employees. I'm going to do that and then run the business out of business because you can't, it's unsustainable. And he was very much aware of this, as was Father Pesch in his writings around the same time as Quadragesimo Anno, saying that obviously all of our duties in how we pay and meet these duties in justice have to be worked out in prudence. And so for a business to, again, just say, well, we're going to distribute all our profit to employees, pay what is a living wage for a family, and then go out of business doesn't actually work towards the common good at all. And again, I'm looking for, I had a quote, but I don't quite see it now, where Pius XI said, for a business to do this, and therefore when a business is unable to meet all these obligations in justice, not because the owner chooses to and says, hey, if I had to meet all these obligations in justice, there's less for me, and I can't take my third vacation this year, and forget it. No, but a business who says, if I do this, because of the unfair economic environment out there, which promotes destructive economics, and ships out all of their labor to Taiwan or to Singapore to pay unjust wages over there. So if I just did this, I would go out of business. Pius XI says, well, that would be bad. That would not be a good thing. So all of these obligations in justice are interrelated and moderated by the principle of the common good. And so, again, we wary of extremes in both cases. The one, well, this is nonsense. I'm just going to pay the cheapest I can to my employee. And I'm going to now go and just blow up the business because I think that's what justice requires. Justice requires an integration of all these in light of our particular circumstances. And so important very much, particularly when talking about legal justice. Now, final areas of legal justice as well is, again, employees are human beings who have natural and supernatural ends. You cannot order the work environment in a way that does not further those common ends. Now, the main goal, the main common end, supernatural end, is for the church. But a business and a business owner has a role in the way people will fulfill those obligations and can affect it. And so the structuring of employment, the structuring of times and places of work, etc., is something that has to be taken into account. Again, the business owner is not primarily responsible for the salvation of souls. That's the priest's primary responsibility, but he is secondarily responsible for it. And so all these decisions have to be made with those issues taken into consideration. So, in light of that, let's run to some perhaps practical solutions that we could apply some of these principles and ideas towards. And again, it's extremely difficult. I want to emphasize we're having to apply them in a dark ages, and ages where everything around us, the entire economic order, the political, the legal order, rejects these principles. And so we're having to apply them in an incredibly difficult time. If we don't need any more proof of that, what was the key principle of the Dark Ages? People needed protection, complete breakdown in law and order. And so people would form relationships. Hey, I'll become your vassal, I'll take care of your land, protect me. Right? Because there's a complete breakdown of society. Well, look at the explosion of security companies in our country, in our world. Again, I know there's one here in St. Mary's, owned by a member of parish. Right? Again, they're good. They're providing the same service that feudal lords had to provide in the Dark Ages. No better proof. We are living in a lawless society. Again, just a small example, but we are living in a society completely off of its moors. And so when we reach the practical, it's going to be a very difficult situation. Related to economics, the idea of unbridled competition is what's going to make this incredibly difficult. If you look at the actual Latin word for competition, I'm going to break it up. It comes from the Latin competere, which actually means to seek together, to seek with. The idea of competition is exactly what we're talking about the common community, to work together for a common goal. That's what competition means. What is modern word? Again, so much modern era has turned things on their head. That means every man for himself, right? Fight it out. And so you're going to have to run your businesses in a world that is not based on competition in the sense of people in an industry working together for their common good. Right? I have my business, you have yours, we're each trying to make a profit, but we're working towards a common end, and we have certain rules of the road where we're fair to each other. You're not working in that in most cases. You're working in a world that If I can save 20 cents, I'll ship my factory to Bangladesh and pay an unjust wage. And you're not going to do that. You're not going to ship to do that because you're going to try to uphold these principles, but you got to work with them in the market. And you know that if you keep your prices where they are and you're going to be driven out of business. Because what is the theory of competition today? Illegal things which would never been allowed in the Middle Ages. Send your stuff to Bangladesh, get it done cheaply, then sell as cheaply as you can, drive everybody out of business, then jack up the prices and make a monopoly and make a lot of profits. That's the goal, right? For their distorted notion. But you have to have your business in that context. And so that's going to require you deciding these issues in that flawed context. And again, you may be prevented from doing a good, but it's not a good you're choosing not to do. You're not saying, well, I'm doing this because I want to, rip off my workers. You may not have the means to fulfill all of these obligations in the way that you should, but it's not through any fault of your own. The means are denied you. Again, another example that may be helpful to traditional Catholics. A mean to get there is Mass. We cannot reach heaven without Mass, the grace of the Holy Sacrifice. But in the world we live in, not everybody can live in St. Mary's. There are lots of people around this country that may be 4 hours from a society priory or mission. And so they know they have to go to Mass. They want to go to Mass. Their intention is to comply with the principle, but they're prevented because of the fallen church, the devastated vineyard that we are living in. And so, in their practical circumstances, they speak to the priest, well, I've got 7 children, we're very poor, we don't have enough money to drive 5 hours every week to Mass, and in those circumstances, still adhering to the principle, if I could, I would go, they have to work out what is prudent in their circumstances. And so that's an important point to keep in mind, the context in which we are doing these things. So, a couple practical points. One, think about these and be aware of these issues as you determine wages and salary and review them for your employees. Again, equivalent exchange, you're never going to be able to get it perfect, given our monetary system for one. But think about it. Am I at least paying this what appears to be fair or equitable for what they're doing? And again, not just rationalize, and not of the principle, the less I pay, the better off I am, but make a good faith effort to evaluate that. Distributive justice. Periodically, and review how your business is performing. Are you proportionally sharing the good that the community has produced together proportionally with employees? Good ways to do this. Have your base salary oriented towards this, and have some organized program for discretionary, profit-sharing bonuses, whatever you want to call them. There are lots of ways to do them. But where periodically, if the firm has a good year, right, some portion of that being shared with those who produced it. Now again, best way maybe to take account of all these principles, be a function both of how well the business does as a whole and what that individual's contribution may have been to that growth. So for someone who maybe did their job but it didn't really cause the greater growth, there's some lesser share of the whole that the business produced. But for, again, maybe a sales team that did extraordinarily well that year, they deserve a greater proportionality. So now, what that also means, what's important for employees to remember is these components are there's where they come from. So when you get a bonus one year, it doesn't mean you're entitled to it next year. If the business has a terrible year the next year, there's nothing left to distribute by distributive justice. So it really should, some version of varying some element of compensation that is a way of estimating what should be distributed to the members from the whole. Again, lots of ways to do it, lots of details to think about, but something to think about. Some kind of a review of this periodically over periods of years. Okay, I run a small business. Here's how I've done over the last 5 years. Have I shared that? Has that been shared with the employees? And what's important is to develop this relationship with employees, to also make what that means on the downside. Because if you're the owner of the business, you know, yeah, you had that in the good years, but what did you do in the bad years to keep the thing going? And if employees understand you're trying to fulfill your duty in distributive justice, it helps them understand their duty in legal justice. So when you have to sit down and say, look, our major competitors done these immoral things to drive their prices down to steal our customers, this is going to be a tough year. We're going to have to all together make some sacrifices to get through this. Distributive justice means an equitable distribution of the goods as well as the obligations. And so, again, being open with employees to say, we're all part of this community together, and I'm going to explain this to you. But again, so much of our mentality, as Pius and Leo XIII talked about, is the alienation, the people against people. Right? The whole idea of community is gone, every man for himself. So it's employer-employee, fight with each other. I get the most I can get, I get the most I can get. And that's the mentality. Trying to change that culture in your business, if it's crept in. And a key element is to make it clear. You want to honor your obligations in distributive justice, and that means you're thinking about it and explain, here's how I'm going to do it. Now, some years there may not be anything. Some years it may shrink if we have problems, but when it's good, I'm going to make an effort to share proportionately. Again, looking on the factors we talked about. And that should be some element of your thinking. The third area, legal justice, is some of the most difficult. Because again, what does this mean? It means orienting everything the business does toward the greater good of the whole society. So, simple examples of this, we talked about the family wage, where you can implement that. Again, very hard in our economy now. But if you're in a closed, smaller environment, like a St. Mary's, where you have people who are heads of families, taking that factor into consideration. Right? Again, into consideration. May not always be possible, but taking it into consideration. You're going to face a real liberal, individualistic objection, right? Because what will they immediately say? That's unfair. Why should he get paid more than me? Well, according to the popes and church teaching, because in justice he's owed more. Because we have an obligation towards the greater good of society, that if we can pay a living wage to a family, as head of family we do. And frankly, that's why, what all the feminists complain about, there were differentials between what women were paid and men were paid in jobs. It wasn't because difference between men and women, but what were the types of jobs that women often entered into in the workforce? They were temporary before they get married, when they were single, when they were not heads of families. The differentials they point to historically were because people were trying to apply these principles of justice. If you're the head of a family, in justice, the business should try to pay you for the good of the society what is a family wage. Again, I'm not telling everyone don't run out, scrupulizing. It's very difficult because of the messed up economy we have to be able to do that. But where it's possible, in circumstance where it is, it needs to be part of the thinking. Finally, with work conditions. Again, these are people who have eternal souls, and their obligations towards the good of the imperfect society of the business have to be reconciled with the good of the whole. And so, where it's possible, structuring work, time, and hours so that people can fulfill their religious duties. Obviously talking about Sunday, being open on Sunday. Again, there's no absolute rule here because this is not a principle. This is living out of the principle. Obviously, there are certain businesses that have people work on Sunday. The security company that monitors people's homes. You can imagine in our dark ages what would happen. They said, well, we don't monitor homes on Sunday. How many burglaries would be committed on Sunday, right? Has to be there. But where there are circumstances where you don't have to run your business on Sunday so that everyone can observe their obligations towards God, again, have to take that opportunity where it's available. Do you have to stay open because everybody's doing it? Two quick examples. In England, I was living in England when I was doing my master's degree when they got rid of Sunday laws. Sunday laws, all retail businesses had to close on Sunday, as late as 1990 in England. What they did, they pressured, got to get rid of it, have the Sunday laws, all the businesses have to be open on Sunday. Because we're losing all this money to other countries by not being open on Sunday. All the economic analysis afterwards, retail shops made nothing more. They just transferred what they would have made on the other 6 days, spread it out over 7. No change. But look at the dynamic. Look how evil this is, what it created. Once all the other shops are open, though, the pie is the same. Everybody's getting the same revenue. There was no additional sales. But now the guy that's open on Sunday is getting more of it than the ones that tried to stay closed because it's getting allocated to them. So what is it doing? An unjust system encouraging people to do what ideally they shouldn't. So again, there may be some necessities, and because we're in this improper world, you may have to have a business open some or part of Sunday, at least to make some arrangements for people to be able to get to Mass if they can't fulfill all their other obligations for Sunday. And last example, I just want to give you to think about, even if it does mean some loss to you, thinking about ordering obligations. Thérèse Martin's father, Louis Martin, ran a watch business. France, way ahead of England, they had the French Revolution, got rid of Sunday trading laws in the 19th century. All the other watchmakers were open on Sunday. And they were pressuring him, yeah, Louis, what are you doing? You're losing business. We're taking your business. Do not open on Sunday. He refused. He never did. He would not open his business on Sunday. He said, this is not a necessary service. People's watches can get fixed on Monday. They can buy a watch on Monday. And he said, I know I may be losing in the short run, but over the course of his career, he said, God took care of me for doing the right thing. And we never wanted for anything in the Martin family. And again, heroic in the circumstance, but a little anecdotal point on that. Again, I can't tell you from here in your individual circumstances what you should do, but it's an example. Last point is very interesting that Pius XI actually specifically talks about in Quadragesimo Anno, giving workers opportunity of leave to go on retreat. And he specifically says, it's very important given the great push in the U.S. district for the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Again, very much he says employers should make sure at least every couple of years employees are given an opportunity to leave work to be able to make a retreat. It's incredibly important for the harmonization of all their ends, the business, their individual, the whole, the common good. He specifically refers to Ignatian retreats. So again, consider, is it something you're able to do in your business? So you have your vacation for everybody, whatever it is, a year, and every 3 years, maybe 2 or 3 years, you get an extra 5 days to go on a retreat. Now, again, the modern world's going to interfere with that. I have to warn you as a lawyer. Because if you just say, well, if you go to a society retreat, you get a extra week off, and you have a bunch of employees that are not Catholic, you're going to get sued for discrimination. That's the distorted world we have. When you try to fulfill your obligation in justice, you get sued. So again, you have to be prudent about this. It also says sometimes you may have to be the practice of tolerance. Remember we talked about the social reign of Christ the King? To promote it, sometimes we have to not in any way allow for the false religious liberty, but to tolerate others so that a greater good can be brought about. Maybe you have to tolerate allowing an extra vacation for non-Catholic workers to implement this for your Catholic workers. Again, it depends on your circumstance. If you're a business in St. Mary's and 100% of your people are traditional Catholics, you probably can get away with implementing if you go on a retreat, we'll give you the paid time off from work to do it. Again, I'm not saying everybody's absolutely required to do it, but that would be an example. Where making decisions in your business with an eye towards the greater good, the orientation to the greater good, is a thing that could be implemented. Again, it gets much more complicated if you have a very mixed workforce and you have to do it in ways because again, to say, I'm going to give all my Catholics a chance to go on retreat, and I'm going to do it in a way that goes against current discrimination law and get sued, you're not pursuing the common good. You're destroying your business. But if you can find a way to do it, I think when I came across that in Quadragesimo Anno, I was really interested to see that he specifically recommends that to Catholic owners of business as a goal for your business to make that possible. Last suggestion to help all of this, and it probably applies more to places like St. Mary's, maybe Post Falls, where there's a greater concentration of Catholic owners, form associations like this. Form associations where business people can work together, competere, where you are, first of all, putting checks on yourself. Right? Again, this is all hard because our individual goods are perceived goods, and our perceived individual goods are all caught up in the mix here. And so it's very easy as fallen human beings due to original sin to rationalize. Oh, I'm paying what's just, and that was the function of the guilds in the Middle Ages, is groups of people come together, form checks on one another. And it's much easier to do this if all the Catholic businesses in St. Mary's are giving retreat week, for example, or are working to implement some form of a just family wage. If your competition is local, your markets are local, it's going to be easier if you're all working towards just Catholic social principles. If you're running a business in the middle of New York City, a sandwich shop, it's going to be very difficult on your own, right? So for those people who are out in the world in isolated islands in the Dark Ages, it's going to be harder. But if you live in an area, form a group like this. Number one, and try to have meetings. That's what the guilds did. What things can we implement? If all the restaurant owners in St. Mary's get together and say, look, we're going to have all the restaurants closed or all the shops close on Sunday or this portion of Sunday. Agreements like that among yourselves so that you counteract those negative forces in the society. Again, my example in England. When everybody was open, there's that pressure now that it's going to hurt your business to not be open. But where you have the ability to form those cooperative organizations among Catholic business owners to implement principles of legal justice, do it. Secondly, they serve this check because you can, again, say, talk about these issues among yourselves. And the best thing is get advice. I think I'm being fair to my employees. These are my profit-sharing plans or my bonus plans. Talk about it among yourselves. Okay? Everybody's the worst judge in his own case. You need to speak with others about it. Obviously, priests in the confessional, if you have serious issues on moral issues, but on the very practical, mundane issues, getting advice from other businessmen on the particular circumstances is very helpful as well. And that was one of the other main goals of the guilds in the Middle Ages, to provide that support, where our modern notion of competition, of everybody isolated by themselves, has utterly destroyed. Finally, support Catholic businesses to the best you can within your means. Right? When you can buy locally, when you can buy from Catholic businesses, you're fulfilling your obligation in legal justice to the society to make these things possible. Because if we're supporting businesses who are trying to live up to these, they're going to have the means to pay according to the principles of justice their employees. So where possible, and when it's able to be done, concentrate on staying local, supporting Catholic businesses. And on that note, final point, we have a very local Catholic business here tonight, Angelus Press, very Catholic, that are selling some books, a lot of the ones I referred to in the lecture, as well as the book that I spoke to you about last year that I published, The Church and the Usurers. And in fact, you can fulfill lots of obligations in legal justice because all of the books sold through a lot of places, but I've committed that all the books sold through Angelus Press, 100% of the sales price goes either to Angelus Press or the U.S. District. So all of my author royalties that I would otherwise have in the book, I've directed towards the U.S. District. So in fact, buying my book here, you can even do more good to promote the work of the Society at Angelus Press. So you can fulfill an obligation in legal justice here tonight by supporting Angelus Press. You can buy me a drink later, Jim. So thank you for your attention. It was a long lecture, a lot of points, but I hope you at least can now orient some of the practical issues in your life towards the principles of truth. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take any questions from the floor that anyone has, and if you have a question, just speak up, please. If anyone has it, just yell it out now, if you would. And then we'll also, if there's any online questions, we will take those. If there's no one here that has a question, we can go there, Jim, if you have any. So ask away.
Unlike my students, I don't give you a grade, so you don't have to be afraid like they are. And they're always afraid to ask questions like
In the case of a non-profit business,
yes.
So when you talk about relationship of distributive justice, there the non-profit is specifically trying to make whatever it does, make its money or whatever, to put into their work, which is ordered, of course, to something higher, to something good. So how does that relationship of the business to its employees, work in distributive justice in that case?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because should I repeat in case people didn't hear? The question was, how do you apply the principle, particularly of distributive justice, to the case of a non-profit business? So a business that's trying to provide a service but not create a profit for owners. I think it's still the principles are very similar because a nonprofit is trying to do the same thing as a business, provide some good to the community, whether it's a school, providing education, or a hospital, for example. But they still generate income. The idea is the income doesn't accrue to individuals, but it's to go back into the business, to go back into the enterprise, so to keep running the hospital or to keep advancing the school, rather than being returned to owners of the business. So I think the same principle would apply. There's still obligations of commutative justice to employees, and there has to be a balance between income that comes into the operating business being applied to continuing it, so expanding the hospital, maybe expanding the school, and sharing some of that with employees who have contributed to it. So I think there's differences and perhaps somewhat of limits on it because there's probably going to be a smaller income coming in just by nature of it. But I still think there would be an obligation to distributive justice to share some of what income is coming in from services rendered to the public or goods sold among employees. The only difference is where that sharing, the distribution goes among owners, managers, employees, it's the entity itself, the commonality itself and its common purpose, managers and employees. And I think you would still have to work through that kind of analysis. Is that?
Perhaps just as a follow-up
Sure.
question on that, so on that line, because sometimes you have a nonprofit that's going to use especially fundraising tactics to bring in money.
Yes.
And so you may have a very successful year in your fundraising. So it seems to me that by the principle, some of that should go back into the people who are working for you to actually keep the business running. Is that
Again, I think the principle's the same. And again, it can be distorted by both extremes. There are a lot of, quote, nonprofits that are out there that are, bringing in income in terms of donations, and 60 or 70% of it's going to all the employees. So again, something like that would be a disproportionate distribution. Whereas, again, it's hard you can't put fixed numbers on it because every situation is different, but that's the principle of proportionality. And so just as there has to be proportionality among equitable sharing with owners, managers, and employees, to the extent that the income of it is donations, and there may be, they need to proportion that properly. And again, it can be by defect, just because you work for a nonprofit, a completely below living wage would be unjust. But likewise, a nonprofit that's taking in donations and channeling most of it to all the people that work there would, by lack of proportionality, be violating not only distributive justice, but violating its own common good. Just so much so is that I think the analogy is still the same. Even for a for-profit business, again, I would say in justice, the owner who channels every cent that he can to himself to the exclusion of every part of the community is creating a disproportion, just like in the nonprofit example. So, but that's really, I actually have never thought of it in that context. That's really a great question.
In the nonprofit world,
Yes.
That's 994, so you can see that.
Yes.
Discuss the wide range of
Yes.
how it goes to what they want to do and how much goes into their pockets.
Yes. And that's why I hesitate. In most nonprofits, I would guess the disproportionality is the other way. I mean, again, a lot of the big giant nonprofits that have made industries out of this, not small local Lions clubs or something, but yeah, Red Cross. I mean, they're violating distributive justice in the opposite way often that we've been talking about.
Could you just repeat whatever?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I will.
Go ahead.
So,
Sorry.
yeah.
How much is a living wage? So, or to soften the ball a little bit,
Yes.
principles should be used to derive
Yeah.
a living wage.
And again, the question was, what is a living wage? And then he softened it a little bit to say, okay, what principle is going to determine it? Again, I can't give you a number, particularly in our economic system where any number I give you will be wrong in 3 weeks, when the Federal Reserve decides to start, quantitative easing again and change the whole system. But the principles Pius XI talked about it was running late, so I skipped over some of the quotes. He says it's basically what is sufficient for a family to have a basic amount to live a basic, respectable human life. So for the amount that a normal family, and remember when Pius XI is talking about normal family, he's not talking about what the modern liberal world would be thinking about, which is 2 parents and a dog. He's thinking about 2 parents and multiple children. So what would be a sufficient amount for them to live a basic life fulfilling their basic duties, material needs, educating their children, rearing their children. Again, that's the principle. Again, even beyond it, abilities of business to do that in the corrupt environment is going to be very, maybe difficult. The issue where you get worried in justice is when you could be paying a wage that level. Again, this just is different from you hire kids over the summer to do some work for you to give them experience. They're not heads of families. They're not employees in this sense we've talked about. We're hiring them for a few weeks to have extra retail help in busy seasons at Christmas. There you're really just dealing with commutative justice. But we're talking with long-term employees who are heads of family. That would be the test that Pius XI sets.
a little bit different angle, but about what duties employers have in a situation where they may have work available, but yet what there may be people in the community who have been without work for a long time. At what point should they not let them just stand out there on the street corner?
Okay, so the question was, what about situations where you may have work available and there are people in your local community who haven't worked for a long time? What are your, maybe, I don't know if you use these words, what are your obligations towards them? Is that basically? Again, it's a multi-factor consideration. I think if there are people in your local community who need work and who know have been out of work, particularly heads of families in particular, to the extent you have work, your obligations in legal justice would be to try to give them the work, if it's possible. Again, take obvious example, you need a CPA in your business. There's a guy in your community who's been out of work for a long time, but he's not an accountant. Okay, obviously, you don't just hire him to be your CPA because he's been out of work. It's not possible within the realm of what your business need is. But again, where there is an opportunity for someone who could do the work, and here's where, again, the Catholic spirit of charity and generosity should come through. Maybe it means in a few cases being willing to take somewhat of a risk. So again, maybe it's somebody, again, it's not like they're not qualified. They could do the work, but they've been out of work a long time. Maybe they struggled in the past. They had, made some mistakes when they were younger. You went to school with them, you knew they were not great, but they really need it. In charity, do you owe them to at least give them a chance? Again, that may be an obligation in charity to be as expansive as you can to the virtue of liberality, to try to fulfill your obligation to your community. But again, it's a prudential balance, right? If you go along and say, well, I'm going to take all the chances we can and hire all these people that are really, taking a chance on, and you destroy your business, you haven't fulfilled your obligation to the common good of the society. So it's where possible, where you can make choices. So again, take another easy case. You've got somebody here in St. Mary's, been out of work, has a family, could do the job, this was their kind of job, or you've got some new person that just graduated from some big school in some other state, not part of the community, not married, doesn't have a family. You say, but they're young, they're real ready, they're eager. Maybe that's the case. You say, we take a chance. I'm going to hire the person here locally. Again, I got to caveat this: our legal system is going to be up against you because they're going to present all these. You're just supposed to make again, our modern legal system, what's best for your business, what's the cheapest, what's the best profit. That's a principle of anything. Or the Catholic notion, you should take all these factors into consideration, right, in reaching a prudential judgment. So again, I would say the obligation in justice to at least consider these things. When you have some work that maybe you could do in your business, maybe you could hire an extra person, you need to consider it if there's a need in your community. Again, that's the nature of the obligation towards the common good, is that it is part of the factor. It should be part of your thinking and your decision, even if under the prudential circumstances you're not able to do it in this case. Again, I hope you're probably frustrated I gave you a very lawyer's answer, which wasn't a yes, go do it, you have to, can't do that. But that's the nature of applying these principles in these difficult circumstances where we live. Yes?
Loyalty.
Yes.
Mutual loyalty
Yes.
be more important in business, perhaps in this today, but it's still an element.
Yes.
Is that an application of justice, or is it simply a business tactic to keep an attractive?
Well, it should be an aspect of justice. And again, I think that's something employees do owe to employers as part of their being part of the community. Again, it's amazing. If you think about it, we've got what has happened on the political level. We've got all these people now, I think it's George Soros, I'm a citizen of the world. There's something wrong with that, right? We're all sort of free agents. Well, I don't like it in America. I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to drop my citizenship there. Huge business, booming business for tax lawyers is expatriation. People jumping regimes to get, I'll get a slightly better tax treatment over here. Again, there's something wrong about that against the virtue of justice, which is virtue of loyalty, which is a component of justice, right? we've talked about the obligations of employers to try to meet these distributive, legal, and commutative justice obligations. The other side of that, again, is the employee is not just, well, I do my job, I clock out at 5 and I'm completely finished. Part of that component of the obligation was, what was, I think, a virtue in our country, was loyalty to employers. Again, it doesn't mean you can never leave a job. Things happen, sick child, you need to move to another city, but you don't just sort of every opportunity you're on the internet, on your coffee break, I can make 50 cents over if I quit this job and go next door for 3 weeks and work there. And this sort of pure calculating, I can eke out another penny by dropping this company and leaving them in lurch and going there. Or again, sometimes you may have to leave the job, but that's not the virtue of justice. In justice, if the employer is trying to meet his obligations to you in the ways we've talked about, you should have a loyalty, express loyalty in a debt to the employer. And say, again, why are you giving me distributive justice? Because I'm a long-term part of this community. If I'm here like minute to minute, I'm out of here. I'm not showing that virtue of loyalty. Now, modern corporate culture talks a lot about loyalty, and I agree with you. I think in most actual cases, that is not informed by the virtue of loyalty, it's PR, right, for the basis of just sounding good. It's a lot of fluff. But at root, there should be a real virtue there of loyalty, which did exist in this country. I tell you, in law firms, the law firm I joined, the partners that were there when I joined had been there from they got out of law school, 30, 40, 50 years. Across the board. By the time I left the firm, there were hardly any that had not been at 7 or 6 or 8 other firms and were there for a year, went somewhere else, took their clients there. The virtue of loyalty is completely broken down. Again, because what is the notion of competition? Gone from working together to every man for himself. That's the model. And if you can get a little bit of an advantage over here, again, that's a violation of the virtue of loyalty that in justice you should owe to the community you're a part of. And again, amazingly, what happens in the economic realm spills over to the political. And you see this, people adopting this attitude, no loyalty to their country anymore. Just, I'll become a citizen whatever country I get the best deal from, which what a lot of these wealthy people are doing. They're negotiating with countries. Well, if I become your citizen, what are you going to do for me? Right? Rather than any type of loyalty. I met this business, it's an amazing story. This business in Canada asked me to come up. It's kind of a New Order Catholic. But he said, I'm really interested in being Catholic and running Catholic business. I've seen you've written things. Will you come and talk to me about it? And all he wanted to talk about was kind of Novus Ordo, schmaltzy, I'm nice to my employees. I created a Muslim prayer room for my Muslim employees. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to say to this guy? He flew me to Canada and I was saying, this is not Catholic principles. And when I said to him, well, what about kind of cultivating the virtue of loyalty, committing to your employees, you're not going to outsource to the Philippines, the food production, and you're going to commit to stay here in Canada with them as long as it's economically possible, right? Oh, I wouldn't do that. If I can save money, I'm going to outsource. And I thought, why did you bring me up here to talk about Catholic moral principles in business? And again, all he wanted to show me was his Hindu and Muslim prayer room where he makes available for his employees to go exercise their freedom of religion to the great force, or I forget what term he used, of all the great religions. I think that was a picture of John Paul II in the room. Again, that kind of thing is clearly not what Catholic principles are about. And again, ironically, the more the schmaltzy stuff that gets out there, this logos of loyalty and all this, I think most of the substance is often not there.
Go ahead. Okay, I don't know if you could answer this. It's not so much from an employer's perspective, but it's a consumer's perspective. Loyalty and trying to have Catholics service to you. How would you answer, I know personal experience and speaking with others, some of the Catholics that try to do business with, they either A, not have the same price as pagan, or same work ethic. They, have their parishioners that sit next to the pew, but their job is not Catholic. So you feel on one hand that you should support your own, but then again, you feel like they're screwing you because they feel, well, I already got to my pocket.
Again, it's a balance in the circumstances. And again, but most of the mentality, again, on the consumer side is the same mentality. If I can save, okay, I can buy a book from Angelus Press for $29. Oh, I can go on Amazon and get it for like 30 cents less. I'm going to do that, right? And again, in prudence, again, maybe in your business you're buying huge amounts of supplies, you'd like to buy from the Catholic person, but it's just you can't profitably make your thing then, you may be constrained. But where you have a choice, and when you're really realistic about what's the difference here, again, I think in legal justice you have a duty to support, to the extent you can, your Catholics in your community, if possible. Now, again, if they're supplying some good that doesn't work and somebody else will actually supply the one that works, okay, you have to balance those interests and those goods. But where it's possible, again, so much of the consumer mentality is, again, I love people, I hate Walmart, I'm so opposed to Walmart, they're destroying the, where do you shop? That's all I shop there. Again, I shop there too, sometimes you have to. But if you have a choice and you could buy the thing at Walmart, or you could buy it for a few cents more at your local place near you, okay? Now again, different circumstances. Maybe you're a family just barely at the poverty line. And every penny does make a difference. So then maybe you say, I'd like to buy from a Catholic person, this is a little less. To make my family eat, I may have to do this. But it's being realistic in ourselves when we really do have a choice, when it really is not a huge sacrifice on our part, where we do have a duty. Now, your last example, I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the question, but your last example, you said, well, what about where you want to support the local Catholic is in the pew with you, but you know his prices are a lot higher, but it's because he's basically lazy and he doesn't really run his business very well, and his prices are high because he's not really doing what he should do. Again, there's a balance there. I mean, that's where charity and justice interact, right? I think you need to, in charity, try to give, where possible, the benefit of the doubt to your Catholic compatriot, right? Okay, it appears he's that way. To the extent you can, maybe try to give him the benefit of the doubt. To the extent you can, maybe support him anyway in charity. However, again, where it's going to reach a point where it's just not possible, that's why these obligations are worked out in details. And I can't, again, give you an absolute rule. These are the components of justice. Can't say you must buy from this Catholic business every time you buy something. That's confusing principles with their application and making the applications into principles. So the answer, again, is a bit, it depends. Where you can make sacrifices that are prudentially still consistent with the common good of your business and your community, to the extent you can. And Pius XI even said, and again, another quote I passed over briefly, I'll summarize. He said, with this distributive justice, he said, look, when the business isn't distributing profits among its members, because there are none, because it's being crushed by unhealthy and immoral competition. I think there was his exact words. So your profit line is very low because your competitors are doing immoral things, economically immoral things to drive you out of business. And you say, look, there's no profit to share. Since you've not violated distributive justice at all. You're a victim of theft because other people are competing in the economy unjustly. They're stealing from profit from you, which is just. And so there is no common good to distribute the employees. And you're not violating distributive justice. The examples he gives you are when you say, well, I have this profit, we've done really well, we've been successful, I'm going to take it all for the owners and nothing for them. But likewise, he actually says the example very much you're talking about. When you mismanage your business, you slack off, you basically, whatever, I'm just going to let it dwindle down, I've made a lot out of it, and you effectively destroy the common good that could have been shared with the employees, you violated their obligations in distributive justice. So again, owners of businesses have incredible obligations. And he refers to that. They're violating distributive justice just as much as the, quote, say, greedy owner. The one who shirks off, who lets his business fall apart just because he's lazy, is not actually doing what he needs to do for the common end of his business and destroys the just profit that could be there, is stealing from the individuals who are members of it who should have been able to share in what's there. So again, it's any position of authority brings great responsibility. For priests, headmasters of schools, owners of businesses. And that's, again, why Pius XI says in Commutative Justice, those who run businesses are entitled to more salary. Because where the obligation is greater, right, what is owed in return is greater. But you can't just collect, the bigger salary and shirk the responsibility. You have grave obligations in justice to work for the common good of your business. And again, that's the important distinction. Why would most modern people in economics say, work really hard to get the best for yourself? That's not the Catholic way. The primary obligation is to seek the common good of that business, to make it the best business, providing the best services and goods you can, and derive a common economic benefit for your business. And again, there's where the individual and the common good come together. By doing that, you're going to create a better business, more profit, and you personally are going to benefit from that as a member of the business that you are leading. But again, the shirking manager, to be many senses, will be judged more harshly than the shirking employee. To he who is given, more is expected. And the shirking employee who just cheats his employer, his greater violation is in commutative justice. The shirking owner, right, is not just in commutative justice. He's destroying the whole community because he has a greater responsibility.
Go ahead.
Yep.
Go ahead. Question on
Yes.
wage. So you mentioned family wage.
Yes.
Pulling that constant for a moment.
Yes.
What proportion of the wage should be based on how high skilled the labor is? What proportion should be based on how indispensable the work is? For example, someone who's a PhD in computer science doing very high skilled work in the office, and you got the guy in the factory who's mopping the floor. Now, hypothetically, let's say that they're mopping the floor without doing that, they could do their job.
Right. Okay.
Let's say they're very important. What proportion of the wage should be based on?
Okay, in thinking about how to put together a just wage, the question was, what proportion goes into the skill of the employee, what skills he brings to the table? There was an example of a PhD who brings some highly trained skills, although just because somebody has a PhD doesn't mean they know anything. Just be aware of that. I work in a university, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean what it always meant. Again, there's a lot of very smart, very good people with PhDs. Don't get me wrong, but our educational system is broken as well, so you can't judge the results by the letters all the time. And again, so skill, and again, talk the example, say the cleaning, the janitorial staff, the person who cleans up the factory floor or the laboratory floor for the PhD scientist. Again, it's a different skill, but it is, you recognize, indispensable to the business. If you didn't sanitize the area, whatever, let's say, the scientist PhD is doing may go wrong, the experiment, because it's not sanitized. So it doesn't involve skill, but it actually is indispensable in its way. The two areas where it factors in, again, I'm not going to give you hard numbers, are commutative and distributive justice. Commutative, and that's where the skill, again, what is he contributing to the business? He has some highly trained skills that he spent 5 or 6 years of school, let's say, maybe hopefully learning, or experience. He was in this industry for a long time. He acquired a lot of technical skill. That's what he's contributing in the exchange, the commutative part of the exchange. And you have to value that fairly. What is that skill worth? Very, very hard. It was hard even when money was a constant, because part of that is its availability or scarcity in the community. Again, I'm not saying the ideas of supply and demand are wrong at all. But remember, they're one-dimensional. They're three-dimensional. Supply and demand is just one in-out. Supply goes up, prices go down. It's much more complicated than that. What's fair is a function of, if there's only one guy in the country that can do it, what he brings to the table is more valuable. So that is a factor in what you're exchanging, because he could exchange it with other people, and so that is part of figuring what's fair. And, what are other people paying, to an extent, is part of the common estimation of what's just, right? So when you're completely off the norm, paying more or less, way off what other people are, that is an element of commutative justice. What's important about Catholic notion of the just price is that it's more than pure supply and demand. There's more factors that are considered. The second area it comes in again is distributive justice. So first, in what to set, I call the base salary. That's a function of where you say, what is what your skill worth? And that's where people with different skill levels will have different levels of salary. The distributive justice is, to what extent is their contribution proportional? And that's where it comes in again, but again, that's where your example of the staff, let's say the janitorial staff, is important. Because it is valuable to the whole. Again, without them sterilizing the area or cleaning it properly, the high-tech thing you're producing will not be produced well. And so they deserve to share, maybe not in the exact proportion or the same proportion as the scientist, PhD, but they deserve to share some proportion of that. Again, I can't give you numbers. It is a multi-factor consideration. What I can tell you is if you say, I reject this, I'm not even going to think about this. My test is I pay the least I can get away with. That I can tell you absolutely that's wrong, right? I can't sit here and say, well, if you say I put, 2% profit sharing to the janitorial staff, 15% to this, 10%, I can't tell you from this podium whether that's right or wrong. It is highly contextualized, and it depends on the circumstances and how it relates. Again, the important thing I can tell you is just saying because it's a job that involves skill that is widely available, that's going to affect commutative justice. That is going to affect the value of the skill in commutative justice. In distributive, if it's really a job that you need to have to make the business run at some level, they're entitled to some portion, some amount. Again, I can't give you exact numbers, but all I can inform is your thinking. And again, I think if you are willing to take these principles into account and say, I'm doing what I can to try to implement them, okay, that's all that the church on the implementation of the moral law asks you to do.
So if there are no more questions, I think that'll
Okay?
conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.